Hello and welcome to Lesson 1 of our class, Basics of Biblical Archaeology. My name is Professor Douglas Petrovich, and I am so glad that you've joined me for this course in the study of the archaeology that relates to the Bible. Today we're going to focus on an introduction to the course as well as a little bit of the history in the whole field of biblical archaeology. We want to start with a context for archaeology. So where does archaeology fit in the greater scheme of things? It fits underneath the umbrella of history. Oftentimes we approach archaeology as if it's an end in itself, but it really isn't. It's only a tool for understanding what really happened to people and what life was like back in their world. So we want to see it in its greater context. There are other disciplines that fit under the umbrella of history, and one of those is chronology. We have to be able to understand the time period that we're looking at and know that the biblical time period fits together with the right moment in ancient history, because without that synchronism that's carefully brought together, we're not really sure if we're looking at the right time and the right place. And so when we find evidence through excavation, it's very difficult with confidence to put them together. So we have to get the chronology right, and the Bible is very explicit about chronology. Then another example is epigraphy. We have ancient writings, and ancient writings help us see firsthand witness and example of what the people themselves were thinking and feeling, and they communicate those in forms such as on pottery or on stone or other instruments, other material that they can be recorded. Geography is another thing that fits under the umbrella. We have to know where the land of the Bible is, the land of Canaan. It's to the northeast of Egypt, and it's to the direct east of the Mediterranean Sea. And it has land above it, the northern Levant, and that's Phoenicia and ancient Syria. And then there's a desert to the east. So all of these kinds of things about geography help us to see how things fit together. Topography, what the land is like itself. Is it hilly? Is it very mountainous? Is it flat land? Is it coastland? Where are the bodies of water in relation to the physical features of the land? So these are the kinds of areas that fit under history, and by studying all of these areas together, we can come up with, in many cases, a good understanding of how archaeology fits in this greater scheme of history. All right, we want to turn our attention to the game board, if you will, where things happen in the ancient world. So here's a map of the ancient Near East. You can see there's a lot of land mass here, and of course it's flattened for us to see it better. It would be rounded if looking at the Earth. And it's at the center that the most important things happen in the biblical world. Now, this area that you see in green, that's what's called the Fertile Crescent. It wasn't as though it meant you had rainfall there all the time, or that you were able to provide for yourself in the ancient world simply without irrigation. Many of these areas required either irrigation or wells or cisterns to be able to survive. But at the bottom line is that in the ancient world, they found a way to get to water. And so this is the area where most of the people lived. Mesopotamia, southern Mesopotamia, is where civilization itself started. Urbanization, and so this whole area of Mesopotamia, this is the right side of the Fertile Crescent. As we look at it, this is where Abraham came from and worked his way around the Fertile Crescent and down into the land of Canaan here and settled in Canaan. This whole area, this half of the Fertile Crescent, is called the Levant, and that consists of the northern Levant, which is ancient Syria, as well as Phoenicia. And then further down here we have the southern Levant, and that really becomes the area of focus where Abraham moves to, and Isaac spends much of his life, and the Israelites consider this to be the land that God promised to Abraham. We also have Egypt here to the southwest again of the Holy Land, and so Lower Egypt is here, Upper Egypt is here. The Nile River flows northward into the Mediterranean Sea. So we're going to be looking in our course at some of the activities that take place in Egypt. So that's important to know where it's located and what's going on in the ancient world, because constantly the Israelites are interacting with the Egyptians. So lots of different places. Of course, the New Testament deals more with Anatolia, especially the western and southern coastal areas here. as well as in the Aegean Sea and then into Europe. And this, of course, is Greece and Macedonia. So those are some of the areas that come to play when we study the ancient world. Where does all of this fit in chronologically with Israel's history, and what's going on with Israel during the time of the biblical period? Well, essentially, we have four main periods, four eras. The first one is the era of formation, which goes from Abram to Joshua, and that's from about 2091 BC, when Abram enters into the land of Canaan, until about 1406 BC, and that's when Joshua leads the Israelites back into the land of Canaan after having been out of the land for 430 years in Egypt and then 40 years of wandering in the desert. So from Joshua to Saul, King Saul, the first physical human king in Israel's history, we have the era of theocracy. Why do we call this the era of theocracy? Well, in Joshua chapter 5, the commander of the armies of He Who Is reveals himself to Joshua and says that he is for him and for the Israelite people. So he is going to go out in front of the army and do the battle for them. That being the case, the idea is that it's God Himself who is Israel's king. They really didn't need another king. The Israelites, all they needed was God. He is the one who would guide them and lead them and would fight the battles for them and confound the enemies and overcome them and bring down the walls of the city. So it's God who rules the people. And the people at the end of this period during the time of Samuel, they didn't like it anymore. They wanted a human king, so they begged until God gave them a human king. And therefore, it's in about 1049 that the reign of Saul begins, and that represents the beginning of the era of monarchy that goes all the way down to 587 BC in the days of Jeremiah, because it's in Jeremiah's day that the Neo-Assyrians under King Nebuchadnezzar come from the east, attack, and wipe out the Judites and destroy the Judite kingdom. And the survivors, those who weren't killed, were carted off into captivity in Babylonia. And at that point, we begin this new era. And that fourth and final era is the era of restoration, from the Babylonian captivity in Jeremiah's day all the way to the days of Nehemiah in about 1445, when we have the building of the wall around the city of Jerusalem. So those are our four eras in ancient Israelite history. All right, let's look at a couple of the forerunners in biblical archaeology. So the first one would be William Flinders Petrie. He was a British archaeologist, excellent for his day in renovating the field of archaeology and bringing about new concepts and practicing new disciplines in the field. So that led to his being called a number of things. First of all, he was called the father of Palestinian archaeology, and part of this is because it's the land of Palestine / Canaan / Israel that he goes into and puts into flesh how we should be digging in the Holy Land to find the sites and the places where events of biblical history took place. He's also the father of Egyptian archaeology because he not only worked in Palestine, but he also worked in the land of Egypt. He's the father of stratigraphy, and that leads us to the distinguishing accomplishments of Petrie. First of all, he created a scheme for dating archaeological layers. And basically, in most of the sites in the ancient world, what happens is you have one occupational phase that then, at the end of that phase, it's burned down or something, or there are people who vacate the site and abandon it for whatever reasons, and then somebody else comes along and they rebuild this. So what they do is they level all of the structures that are in usually broken down kind of form, and then they'll put fill there, gravel and stone and soil, and then they'll start building up again. So older layers are below, and then a new layer is on top, and you have succeeding layers as they go. And so with archaeology, when you study a site, you're digging down, and you're starting at the most recent layers, going down further into older layers. And where occupational layers begin and where they end is a very important question that you have to solve as an archaeologist. So Flinders Petrie was the first to excavate in a way that he was carefully documenting changes in the levels of the strata or the occupational areas, and defining those, seeing where they start and how we know where it starts and how we know where it ends, changes in the soil color, changes in the composition, changes of the material found there, where there are burn layers to show that a certain occupational layer, a certain occupation of the site was destroyed. All of those are features that he helped to develop, and for that he became the father of stratigraphy. Petrie also originated ceramic typology, which is the basis for stratigraphic dating. So what Petrie did is he looked at pottery and saw that you had uniform styles in various periods. Those same occupational levels that you can clearly show the definition of individual occupational periods where you have different people of different times, you can also connect a certain period with a kind of pottery that's constantly, regularly used, and a model that the ceramicists of the day, the potters, that they use. And so that helps to be able to when looking at other sites, compare and make sure you have the right occupational phases lined up. And ceramics, the pottery remnants, are the perfect tool for doing that, because there's nothing more. We use the word diagnostic for checking this, and diagnostic meaning that it reflects a certain way of doing things or a certain period of time or a certain style. And so the diagnostics are very clear. And so he originated ceramic typology. He also held the first chair of Egyptology at the UK, and that's a very important role as someone who is now teaching others the field of Egyptology as a result of all of the excavation that he did at the site. And he's also the first archaeologist to investigate the construction of pyramids. And of course, pyramids are where some of the earlier kings and dynasties, especially 4, 5, and 6, were buried, and the kings had elaborate tombs that were built under the pyramids. So Petrie was one of the first to study and discover those. Then we have another important ancient figure of ancient biblical archaeology, and that is William Foxwell Albright. Some of his distinguishing accomplishments include conducting groundbreaking excavations at a site called Tel Beit Mersim. And so he did a lot of work at Tel Beit Mersim that kind of became the standard for others excavating in the land of Israel to follow. So he built on Petrie's work in the Holy Land. He also defined strata of Bronze and Iron Ages at Tel Beit Mersim. So he was carefully marking the stratigraphical changes that took place in ancient sites, measuring them according to whether they're part of the Bronze Age, such as early, middle, or late Bronze, and then the Iron Age 1, 2, and 3, etc. He also based his dating on ceramic typology, and he followed Flinders Petrie in this. So Petrie wasn't the only one to use ceramic typology. He simply began the process, and others followed it and refined it further. So some of the innovations that took place with ceramic typology were instituted by Albright. And then he was the editor for many years, actually several decades, for a publication called the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research. So he edited that. He made sure there were good articles being added to it, and he made sure that they were well written and well cited, and probably solicited some really good peer reviewers to help him to be able to do that. In fact, he was responsible for many of the later archaeologists and their students. And so his students, among them at least, are George Ernest Wright, Frank Moore Cross, David Noel Friedman, Raymond Brown, and John Bright. So all of these were luminaries in their own time in the field of biblical archaeology, and they were taught by William Foxwell Albright. So he's another important figure. And there are other important figures in in the study of the archaeology of the ancient Near East and the biblical world, but time causes us to need to move on. So now we're going to talk about components in an archaeological dig. What are you going to experience if you go on a dig yourself and participate? What will you need to have in your hands to be able to do the work of an archaeologist? Well, first let's look at the area that you would dig. And depending on where you're going in the ancient world, your site may be on a different kind of, founded on a different kind of basis. You could be excavating a site that's on sand, that's along a coast, or you could be excavating a tell. And a tell is essentially a mound. It's built up, and over time, it's built higher and higher because of future occupational phases. So the tell itself is a rise. And of course, in the ancient world, you needed to be up on high ground because that would then give you an advantage against anyone coming to attack you. And usually they're coming from below, so you could defend yourself better if you had a position that's much higher up. So a tell is represented by the grid system such as this, where you can see the highest point here measuring 25 meters. And so this is the Acropolis, or the high point on the tell. And then as you go lower, it moves out, and so you get down to 20 meters above sea level, and then 15 and 10 and 5 and etc. So as you go down the mound, you go down in the elevation. And what archaeologists do is they use a grid system like this, and there are different ways to do it. You could make it A through Z or whatever going one way, counting Arabic numbers down from 1, etc. And now what you do is you define a certain square in a grid style that falls within a certain place on the tell. So for example, the high point here, the highest point on the tell, if we're going to excavate here, we would call this E3. And so everything that the archaeologists pull out of the ground is designated as coming from square E3. And that makes it much more specific to be able to track the materials that are coming out, the material finds, so that you can then understand how things are working on the site and publish well, so that people who are studying your work can see exactly where you pulled your artifacts from. So in the land of Canaan, a tell, a mound, is usually where people lived, and that would often be a hilltop or something to that effect, an area that they could defend. And so one occupational level, or stratum as we call it, was built on top of another. So when people was wiped out or left, they vacated the site and somebody else came to live there, and it was just built up, one layer added onto another. So we're going to look at a cross-section of a tell and see some of the features here. First thing that we want to look at is the stratigraphy. And basically, we have different levels here of occupation. So the earliest levels of occupation would be at the bottom, at the base, and the more recent levels of occupation would be up here in this area. So each one of those occupational layers is considered a stratum. So that's how we designate a level where people lived. So that's the stratigraphy. And then this area also has a lot of rock and soil in it, and as you're excavating it as an archaeologist, of course, you're constantly using pick and shovel and other tools to get rock and debris out of there. Some of it is what we call floating, such as floating rocks that simply have to come out. They're not attached to anything. So we have to deal with that, and you can see in this stratum here, for example, they're designating for you various rocks and other things that are debris that you come in contact with when you're involved in an excavation. Deposition is the depositing of materials at some place on the site. So, for example, in this pit here, right here, you see this very deep pit that digs down far into the tell and through all kinds of layers. There's the deposition of objects in it as you go. And of course, a pit is something that is very important, because what you can do is you can take material that's from a current occupational phase. Let's say we live on this occupational phase, and we dig a pit that goes down into this area. As we do that, we drop some of our things, accidentally or purposefully, down in this pit, such as the pottery and potsherds from what we have. And what happens is when somebody excavates down this low, they think they should be excavating a much earlier phase here, but they're finding material from this level, and it's strange to find it there. So you're always having to be conscious of whether there's an anomaly like this, such as a pit. So you have to take that into account when excavating. We also have architecture on a site, and that's where people lived, that's public buildings, and essentially it's something that has been constructed. So that shows up on the tell as well, such as the form of this. For example, that could be an early city wall, or an outer city wall at least. And this city wall, you can see the column of bricks here and a column of bricks here, and that shows you that this is clearly man-made and it's built up. So you'd want to investigate this as an archaeologist. If possible, you'd want to be able to somewhere get underneath it and find material that's datable to see when it was that that wall was built there. They're depicting another wall here in this image, and you can see that it's cut off here. So, and that's true at just about any site. You're going to have walls and buildings that exist maybe only in the foundational level or a couple of feet high, something to that effect. So that's very common. But you will come in contact with architecture such as this, and that's a very important part of the excavation. Then there's the whole question of pottery, and you can see that a lot of pottery is drawn here for us, and essentially suggesting that it may have come from a certain occupational level. And so pottery is extremely helpful. It's the most important tool in what we call relative dating. Because what we're able to do is if we have, for example, a piece of pottery that's found right here at this level, on this, within this stratum, and maybe in that stratum there's something that's even more datable, such as an Egyptian scarab that has a royal cartouche of the king on it, then we know very specifically when that dates to, because we will oftentimes or most times know the regnal years, when the king went on the throne and when he came off the throne. And so then that pottery becomes datable by means of the scarab, and checking with other sites, it can be confirmed. So if you find then that same kind of pottery that was found here at another site that maybe doesn't have clear indicators, such as a scarab or something, then you're able to use this relative dating to essentially make equivalent this stratum on your site with that same stratum from another site. So it's all part of working together site by site in the same region, looking for material that relates to the other sites. There are lots of other artifacts, such as weapons and tools and so forth, that you can find in an excavation. So you're always looking for artifacts. And even as we spoke about with scarabs, that's an extremely important artifact. Very difficult to find because they're so small, and they're usually caked with dirt in such a way that when you see it, you're thinking that's either a clump of dirt or it's a small rock that just has dirt attached to it. And it really takes care to be able to see artifacts, especially small ones, like scarabs and beads and so forth. And it's for this reason why archaeology has introduced the practice of using screens and so forth to be able to sift the material to look for the small things. So there's a dry sifting stage, and then many excavations now have added a wet sifting element to it as well. So we already talked about pits, and then there are burials, such as here. You can see that there's a skull and bones. There are stones placed over this tomb here. So this is a clear example of someone who's been purposefully buried, and as it works in the archaeology world, that's something that you can end up excavating to be able to learn more about the people who lived there at the time. And then finally, you're going to see things like charred remains. And I think this is what's being depicted here with these black bricks, or this black material. This represents a layer of charred remains. It can be very thin. You can have very small charred remains, or you can have a meter thick or so. charred remains. It all depends on the site and the area on the site, how intense was the fire of the burning. But in the ancient world and in the field of archaeology, burning is something very important. It's very useful, very helpful. Probably tombs are one of the most important things to find, but another one of the most important things to find in an archaeological excavation is a burn layer, or an area that was destroyed by an intense conflagration or destruction by fire, because we can learn so much through it. Here's another cross-section just to show you a little bit different of a flavor. With this view, we can see one part of the city wall on this side and another part of the city wall on this side. And of course, the city wall would have come all the way around in a full circle. And this represents the time periods, the city wall that would encompass, in many cases, several time periods. So these strata then get names. In this case, this is just one way of doing it. We have letters such as M and L and K and J and H, and the layers, of course, being represented there. We have other walls here, wall T and wall U. This represents a hole that was dug or burrowed out by an animal. So again, a rodent can come down here and dig down in, and then pottery that's on the surface can fall down in and then end up depositing down here when it's from 400 years later and not 400 years earlier, as would be the case, for example, with the earlier stratum where it came from. A pit represented here, and of course you have bedrock represented in this light color below, so the mound is typically going to be setting on bedrock. And then we have what's called virgin soil over here. That is essentially soil that's not really been worked before, even by the ancient people. It was just sitting there. It was untouched, as it were, when the city was occupied. So digging down into virgin soil can take you to bedrock, or maybe help you find things that show up there that kind of ended up there by accident. So these are the kinds of things that you're going to see when excavating a site. Then there's also another problem that you could come in contact with. Let's say we have the basis or the foundation of some kind of architecture here. So there's monumental architecture. And this is, maybe we'll call it wall A or something like that. And then we have wall B over here. And when you look at the two of them, they seem like they're contemporaneous, because if you measure them with their elevation, which is one thing that's important in archaeology, always to get the elevation of something, if they show up about the same place elevation-wise, then we have to ask the question, are they contemporaneous? And they may be, but in some cases, it's not that way at all. Maybe, for example, you could have a stratum change above wall B here, and it goes downhill, as it were, until you hit this level, and it keeps going. And so on top of this is A, and wall B here is from an earlier period, and that's at least one stratum below. So in that case, these are not contemporaneous structures. So these are some of the things that we're going to encounter when we excavate at a site in a land such as Canaan, the land of the Israelites. We're going to dig down into the mound and look for everything that we can find to be able to uncover the story of what took place, both when the people lived there at the site and whatever ended their occupation. So now we want to look at some examples of excavation that has been done that will give us a better glimpse into the world of archaeology, to see how things look when we indeed uncover the remains of what were there. So this is the result of an excavation that was done at Hatzor, a picture taken in 2007. In the early 2000s is when the actual excavation here took place. This is in Area M at the site of Hatzor. Hatzor is located in the Jordan Rift Valley, very hot, very arid place near near Lake Hula up in the north in northern Canaan. So here we can see some of the structures that are involved. And as we look downward, we're actually moving down in occupational levels. So this was an Israelite period here with these standing stones. And this architecture here, it's actually made of black basalt, and it's part of a temple that was Canaanite in the Canaanite period before the Israelites actually settled at the site. And then we go to, and that's in the late Bronze Age II period, the final Canaanite city there. And as we go down further, we're looking at parts of the occupational area that were inhabited even early in late Bronze I and then in the Middle Bronze Age. So that's an example of looking at excavations at Hatzor. Then we have, for example, how this is a great example of how things look when we're excavating, because archaeologists determined that making squares helps us to be able to see well the stratigraphy against the sides of the area of excavation. As we're digging down, we're able to see the changes in the soil and the composition of the materials that are there. So digging down in squares involves bulks, the making of bulks. So these areas that aren't excavated, all of these are bulks. And so the bulks then become an area where you can stand on, where you can walk on, and they can, again, show you the stratigraphy as you're digging down and looking at the side. And then, of course, as you go down, you're finding things such as walls here, so there will be architecture and other discoveries that are made. And so each excavation has a number of team members that are working specifically in one square. Usually it's between 2 and 6 or 7, depending on how big the team is and how big the site is. And so they're digging down, and the goal in archaeology is to dig down in a level way so that you can evenly see what's taking place and not be excavating certain important features that become of interest to you where you're taking them out of their context. So to give a good context, you need to go down in a level way. So as you dig down, you put sandbags up on top of the bulk to protect it, and then you keep digging down according to the area of excavation. So then you would discover architecture such as this at Hatzor, where you have a drain, an ancient drain. So they would have had canalization, which also we would connect to plumbing to be able to move things out of the city that you don't want to have near you if you're an occupant in the city. And then this cistern here represents an area where these things would drain down into. Here is some work being done at Hatzor in 2007. You can see we started a new square of excavation on virgin soil. So we dug down from the top, and now we're going down level. And we're here at this point in the Persian period, looking to be able to go down even further to find Israelite and Canaanite occupational sites. So we have tools for the process. Obviously, a pick is your most important tool to be able to actually do digging, so you use that to dig down. And as you do that, you expose dirt, and the dirt is collected into buckets such as these, taken away, and then it's sifted to be able to see what kinds of items may be found, such as scarabs and other things inside there that can be important finds. And a dustpan, of course, can be used to scoop into the buckets, and then away they go. Other tools that are important, a shovel such as this. This isn't the typical shovel that we use in the United States, but it's a shovel that will allow us to be able to scoop much better and without hurting our backs in the process. Then there are hand tools such as these. And the most important tool for an archaeologist is the hand trowel. And that essentially is like a small shovel, a small hand shovel, if you will, that allows you to define things carefully and dig in a concentrated, concerted area to be able to reveal something that you need to see and understand very clearly. Then we have brushes for example, when we find architecture and just cleaning it away, cleaning the debris away, the dust or the dirt from it, so you can take a brush and clean it safely with this, and the architectural pieces of stone or whatever will stay in their position because you have soft bristles that are working against it. So once we've dusted things away, then we can take photographs of what was left. Here's part of the Persian period excavation being done at Hatzor to show you a large team at work with a lot of not only workers but materials and tools and lots of labor involved. So you have, again, people who are digging with picks, and people who are scooping with shovels, and then people who are looking at things more carefully with finer instruments such as trowels and brushes. And then we have the cleanup that's involved, because a lot of times you find materials that you don't need, such as large stones. And large stones are an example of something that need to be moved away from the site. And so you have to collect those into things such as wheelbarrows and haul them away and find a place to be able to dump them. So there's a lot of work, and you can see in the work of archaeology, it's a destructive science because you only get one chance to excavate, and once material is removed, it's gone for good. Then with the material finds that are left, then more careful work is done to be able to start to study them. So especially with pottery and other things, but pottery most often and in greatest number, they're divided according to where they were found and what stratum it's connected to, what occupational phase, and they're cleaned and they're placed here, and then they're dated and separated according to time periods. And that then helps us to be able to define exactly what's going on with the site at the materials where we've found the pottery. And so with more important diagnostic pottery, and that's a pottery that, for example, has a rim sherd that's been preserved, or it has a base that's been preserved, or in some cases a handle that's been preserved, that will help us know exactly, based on other parallels where you have a full pot or a full bowl or a full other, such as a bilbil, other ceramic objects, you'll be able to know exactly what that was a part of, and that will help you be able to date it more specifically. So here, this team member is writing codes on each one of these diagnostic pottery pieces so that we can always know exactly where it came from in the site. The right area, the right field, the right square, the right locus. It all can be defined and then recorded on the back of the potsherds. So that's all part of the process. Then there are artifacts from an archaeological dig that maybe we can look at. And of course, the most important is pottery. And based on the styles, they can help us to see different periods, such as the Neolithic period, and that means the period of the New Stone Age, the Chalcolithic period, which comes after that. In the Levant, we have the Early Bronze Age, the Middle Bronze Age, the Late Bronze Age, Iron Age 1 and 2, and then Iron Age 3. So pottery styles change slightly from period to period, and this gives us a pottery typology for one specific time frame, one archaeological period. And then that helps us to be able to know what they were using to eat and to drink, where those materials came from, and obviously in studying the pottery itself and its composition, if we test what were the materials that it was composed of, we can find the actual places where it was made, whether it was in the Aegean Sea area or whether it was a local piece of pottery, or whether it's from Egypt, wherever the materials may be from. It helps us to be able to locate that. So pottery is the most important artifact to be found. Here's an example of a jug from the Persian period that we excavated when I was part of the dig at Hatzor. And we had an exciting time, coming upon this pot and being able to dig down and find this piece of pottery and carefully excavate the area that's around it to be able to pull out the pot. We also have, especially from tombs, we have full pieces of pottery, such as this chocolate on white Canaanite jug that's specific to the late Bronze I period. We know that because of its bichrome color and because of its chocolate on white lines here. Other pottery of that time period has, for example, geometric images to it. Speaking of geometric, these specific kinds of geometric designs are native to the Aegean Sea area and the areas around Greece. And in Athens at this time, between 1030 and 900, we had this specific geometric style of pottery design that was followed, and it then spread to other areas. So this piece of pottery here actually is from Canaan. It's from the Holy Land itself, and it's a local-made piece of imitation ware that uses the same designs as the Aegeans used. So what this helps with is, and we know that it's around 1000 BC when these were introduced into the Levant. So when we find jugs like this, we know that it can be dated to the 10th century BC. And that, of course, is the time period of King David and Solomon. So these kinds of finds are very important because they can help us know exactly the right time period and connect it with biblical figures, such as the kings of Israel and Judah. We also have weapons that are found, such as this ring pommel sword from the Roman era that's made of iron. And so this is a New Testament era artifact. And this sword can help us understand what was going on between the Romans and, in this case, the people who lived in the Holy Land. Then we also have epigraphical finds, such as this bilingual ostracon. And this is a very important ostracon because it has this inscription that reads from left to right, top to bottom here, that begins in Egyptian, it ends in Egyptian, and what's in the middle, all of this central line in the first letter over here, is what we call Proto-Consonantal Hebrew alphabet. And so this is one of the inscriptions. It's called the Lahun Bilingual Ostracon that I discuss in my first book, The World's Oldest Alphabet, that identifies Hebrew as the language of the world's first alphabetic script. And it goes all the way back to the 19th century BC. In fact, this very inscription dates to the 12th dynasty or to the 19th century BC. So once I've carefully drawn this out electronically right over top of a good photo of the inscription, I can then pull away the photo, and this is what's left, which allows me something as an epigrapher to be able now to decipher. And I was able to study this and to decipher it. And it definitely is a renal formula, so a formula to demonstrate the reign of a certain king of Egypt in the 19th century BC. And it's the reign of Amenemhat III, who rules in the middle of the 19th century. And so there's a renal date there, and then there's a message here written by a Hebrew speaker and someone who could write in good Hebrew. And essentially he's talking about the celebration that took place as a result of the completion of the building of a house. And it's a house that's ascribed to the king. So I discuss all of this in my 2016 book on the world's oldest alphabet. And then finally, we have objects such as these. We have a loom weight here, and this was used to be able to, to create fabrics that are used in materials that can be turned into clothes. So to make those clothes, a loom is used, and then a counterweight helps in the process to be able to complete the task. Then here we have a basaltic bowl or mortar. And again, these are both from the site of Katsor. So probably this is a mortar. It could be a bowl. I can't see the bottom of it, but it's probably a mortar where with a pestle you can break something down. So for example, you would have grains that you'd break down into smaller sizes to be able to make bread or whatever. So there are lots of different purposes for these kinds of things. And the fact that these are black basalt shows you that this is a rock that's connected with volcanic activity. So these are the kinds of things that we are going to find at archaeological sites. And from here, we're going to focus our attention more toward, first of all, kind of defining biblical archaeology and then starting to look at some of the sites. So I hope you're excited about joining us for this look into the world of the ancient Israelites and their neighbors, where we can learn much more about their lives through the vehicle of archaeology.